The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Naval Special Warfare's advanced training facility at Coronado. Heat waves shimmered across the parched earth, distorting the view of distant targets that stood like tiny specters on the horizon. The temperature hovered at 98 degrees, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture from the skin with each breath. A deceptive breeze occasionally swept across the range, just enough to cool the sweat on a man's brow before disappearing, but experienced shooters knew better. That breeze was the enemy of accuracy, a silent saboteur that could push a bullet off course over extreme distances. Lieutenant James Blackwood stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his state-of-the-art SCAR-H sniper rifle slung casually across his back. The weapon was a marvel of modern engineering, equipped with an integrated ballistic computer system that could calculate a dozen variables in milliseconds. Its price tag of $15,000 was just the beginning. The advanced optics and custom-loaded ammunition pushed the total investment to nearly twice that amount. But to Blackwood and his team, fresh from a successful mission in Syria, the equipment was worth every penny. "Another perfect grouping, sir," said Petty Officer Wilson, handing Blackwood the spotting scope. "3 shots within an inch at 800 meters. Blackwood took the scope without acknowledgement. His silence was not rudeness, but the quiet confidence of a man who expected nothing less than excellence from himself and his team. At 35, he was already a legend within the SEAL community, with 4 combat deployments and more confirmed kills than most operators would see in a lifetime. His team gathered around him, a collection of the finest warriors the United States military had to offer. Each man was sculpted from the same mold of supreme physical conditioning and deadly capability. They moved with the easy grace of predators secure in their status at the top of the military food chain. "Let's push it out to 1,500, Blackwood said, his voice carrying the casual authority of natural leadership. "I want to see how this new load performs at the edge of its envelope." The men nodded, already moving to adjust their equipment. The advanced range at Coronado was one of the few places in the world where they could test their skills at extreme distances, a luxury they didn't take for granted. Today was meant to be a relaxed training day, a reward for the intensity of their recent deployment, but these men didn't know how to dial back their competitive nature. The sound of tires crunching on gravel caused several heads to turn. A weathered pickup truck, at least 20 years old and covered in the dust of long highways, pulled into the parking area adjacent to the range. The vehicle seemed out of place among the government SUVs and personal luxury cars favored by the officers. "Looks like we've got a visitor," Wilson remarked, squinting against the sun. Blackwood glanced over disinterestedly, then returned to adjusting his scope. Civilian observers occasionally visited the range, usually retired military or government officials with the right connections. They were typically given a polite tour and sent on their way, never interrupting the serious business of training. The truck's door opened with a protesting creak, and a man stepped out slowly, deliberately, as if measuring his movements against some internal metronome that played at half the speed of the modern world. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", but with the slightly stooped posture of someone who had carried heavy burdens for too many years. His clothes were clean but faded functional garments chosen for comfort and durability rather than style. Khaki pants worn thin at the knees. A button-up shirt in a muted blue that had seen countless washes. Boots that spoke of miles walked in harsh terrain. But it was his face that commanded attention, despite the man's apparent desire to blend into the background. Weathered and lined like the cracked leather of his boots, it held a pair of pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His hair, once dark but now a steel gray, was cut short in a style that hadn't changed in decades. The man retrieved a long canvas case from the truck bed, handling it with the careful reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts or sleeping children. He zipped the case open and began methodically removing items, laying them out on the tailgate with slow, deliberate precision. Blackwood's attention was drawn back to the visitor when he heard Ensign Cooper's poorly suppressed snicker. "What in the hell is that piece of junk?" Cooper asked, making no attempt to lower his voice. Blackwood turned fully now, his interest piqued by his junior officer's lack of discretion. The old man was removing a rifle from the canvas case, and even from a distance, Blackwood could see it was unlike anything currently in the military's arsenal. The weapon was a chimera, a bastardized blend of old and older. The stock appeared to be dark walnut, beautiful in its way, but marred by a prominent crack near the grip that had been wrapped with what looked like electrical tape. The barrel was long and heavy, clearly designed before modern lightweight alloys became standard. But most surprising was the scope mounted on top, an ancient-looking device that seemed more at home in a military museum than on an active shooting range. "Seriously," said Wilson, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Did he pull that out of his grandpa's attic, or maybe a dumpster?" The team's laughter rippled across the range, carried on the desert breeze. The old man gave no indication that he heard them, continuing his methodical preparation as if he were alone in the world. Blackwood found himself moving toward the visitor, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't quite name. His team fell in behind him, always eager to follow their leader, especially when the promise of entertainment loomed. "Sir," Blackwood said, his tone professionally polite but undercut with barely concealed amusement, "this is a restricted training facility. Are you sure you are in the right place?" The old man looked up, his movements unhurried. Those pale blue eyes met Blackwood's, and for a fleeting moment, the SEAL officer felt an unnerving sensation, as if he were being weighed and measured against some standard he couldn't see. "I was invited," the man said simply, his voice a low gravel rumble like stones rolling in a slow river. "Invited by whom?" Blackwood pressed, his skepticism evident. "Admiral Bennett," the man replied, returning his attention to his rifle. He ran a soft cloth along the barrel, his touch gentle, almost reverent. Blackwood exchanged glances with his team. Admiral David Bennett was the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, not someone who typically extended casual invitations to civilians to visit their most advanced training facilities. "And you are?" Blackwood asked, his tone sharpening slightly. "Sullivan," the man answered without looking up. "Raymond Sullivan." The name meant nothing to Blackwood or his team. It was just another name, unremarkable and forgettable, like the man himself seemed designed to be. "Well, Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood said, emphasizing the civilian address, "I'm Lieutenant James Blackwood. This is my team, and we're conducting specialized training exercises today. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about the schedule." Sullivan didn't respond immediately. He continued his preparations, checking the action of his rifle with practiced movements that spoke of decades of familiarity. Finally, he looked up again. "No misunderstanding," he said. "I'll stay out of your way until the Admiral arrives." Blackwood felt a flare of irritation at the old man's calm dismissal. He was used to command to respect, especially here in his domain of expertise. "That's quite a unique rifle you've got there," he said, nodding toward the weapon. His tone made it clear that unique was not a compliment. Sullivan nodded slightly. "She's seen better days," he acknowledged, "but she still works." Cooper laughed openly now. "Works for what, scaring pigeons off a fence post?" The team chuckled, their derision a physical presence in the air between them and the old visitor. Blackwood studied the weapon more closely. Now that he was near, he could see that what he had taken for simple neglect or poor maintenance was something else entirely. The modifications to the rifle, though crude by modern standards, showed a deep understanding of ballistics and the practical challenges of long-distance shooting. "That's an M21, isn't it?" Blackwood asked, genuine curiosity momentarily overriding his condescension. "Close," Sullivan said. "Started as an M14, rebuilt as an M21 platform. Been modified since then." "I can see that," Blackwood replied, gesturing to the electrical tape wrapped around the stock. "Field repairs." A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's weathered face. "Something like that." As Sullivan set the rifle on the shooting bench, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm. Blackwood caught just a glimpse, but he recognized the distinctive emblem of Delta Force, specifically associated with early operations like Eagle Claw, the failed 1980 hostage rescue mission in Iran. It was not the kind of tattoo an imposter would choose. It was too specific, too tied to a particular time and mission that most civilians wouldn't even know about. For the first time, Blackwood felt a flicker of uncertainty about the old man. Delta operators were legendary. The elite of the elite, and the early pioneers of that unit were spoken of in hushed tones even among the special operations community. But the moment passed quickly. Whatever this man might have been in his youth, he was now just an old relic with an obsolete weapon. The modern battlefield had no place for such anachronisms. "Look, Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood said, his confidence returning. "This is a Tier 1 facility. We're practicing shots here that require the most advanced technology available. Why don't you take your hunting rifle over to the public range? They have shorter lanes, more your speed. The disrespect was a physical thing, a wave of dismissiveness that would have cowed most men. But Sullivan simply continued his preparations, seemingly impervious to the insult. "I'll wait," he said again, his voice betraying no emotion. Blackwood felt his irritation growing into genuine annoyance. The old man's calm was somehow more infuriating than any angry response would have been. "Suit yourself," he said, finally turning back to his team, "but stay clear of the firing line. We've got serious work to do." As they walked back to their position, Cooper leaned in close. "$10 says he can't hit a barn from the inside." The team laughed their amusement, carrying across the range. Sullivan gave no indication that he heard them, but his eyes tracked their movement with an intensity that suggested he missed very little. The morning progressed with Blackwood and his team working their way through increasingly challenging shooting exercises. They were undeniably skilled, capable of accuracy that would astonish civilians and impress even other military snipers. But as they pushed the distances further, their success rate began to drop. At 2,000 meters, even with their advanced equipment and perfect shooting conditions, hitting the target became a genuine challenge. The bullet's time in flight stretched to several seconds, during which wind conditions could change multiple times. The curvature of the Earth itself became a factor, as did the Coriolis effect caused by the planet's rotation. Blackwood took his position behind his rifle, going through his mental checklist with practiced efficiency. He calculated for wind speed direction, temperature, humidity, and a dozen other variables. The ballistic computer in his scope provided exact adjustments, which he dialed in with confidence. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger during the natural pause between heartbeats. Just as he'd been trained, the Scar H barked sharply, the sound rolling across the desert. Through his spotting scope, Wilson tracked the vapor trail of the round as it arced toward the distant target. "Impact high and right," Wilson called, about 8 inches off center. Blackwood frowned. A miss was a miss, regardless of how close it came. He made a slight adjustment to his scope and fired again. Still high, about 5 inches now. One by one, the team took their turns. They were all exceptional shooters, but the extreme distance pushed the limits of their abilities and their equipment. After several rotations, not one of them had managed to hit the center of the target consistently. A tense silence fell over the group. They were used to excellence, to pushing boundaries, and succeeding. The invisible barrier of extreme distance shooting was a rare frustration. Blackwood stood and rolled his shoulders, releasing the tension that had built during the precision work. "Mirage is getting worse," he said, referring to the heat waves that distorted vision over long distances. "And the wind is shifting unpredictably. Even the best equipment in the world can't fully compensate for Mother Nature." He turned his gaze, falling on Sullivan, who had been quietly observing their efforts while continuing his own methodical preparations. A cruel smile played across Blackwood's face. "All right, Grandpa," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "Your turn. Show us how it's done." It was a joke, a final act of humiliation. The entire team turned to watch, several pulling out their phones to record what they anticipated would be an amusing failure. They expected the old man to refuse to back down from the challenge and the accompanying ridicule. Sullivan said nothing. He simply picked up his rifle and moved toward the firing line with unhurried dignity. The ancient weapon seemed to settle into his shoulder as if it were an extension of his body. He didn't go prone like the SEALs had done. Instead, he adopted a modified sitting position, using the shooting bench as a stable platform. He didn't use a spotting scope to check conditions downrange. He didn't refer to a ballistic calculator or environmental sensors. Instead, he plucked a single frayed piece of yarn from his pocket and held it up, watching it subtle dance in the breeze. His eyes narrowed as he observed not just the target, but the entire space between himself and it, studying the heat waves rising from the desert floor with an intensity that suggested he was reading them like a sailor reads the surface of the sea. The SEALs were openly snickering, now filming with their phones, already thinking about the caption for the video they would share later. "Old-timer thinks he's Chris Kyle, perhaps, or Grandpa's last stand." Sullivan took a deep, slow breath. His entire being seemed to narrow to focus down the length of that ancient barrel. The world around him, the mocking laughter, the shimmering heat, the weight of the years, all of it faded away until there was only him, the rifle, and a whisper of wind. His finger began to tighten on the trigger, his concentration absolute. The SEALs watched with amused anticipation, waiting for the inevitable miss and the opportunity for one final round of mockery. But just as Sullivan's finger reached the crucial pressure point, the crunch of tires on gravel announced a new arrival. A black SUV with government plates rolled to a stop behind the firing line, the tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants. Sullivan paused, his concentration broken, but his position maintained. He didn't look away from his scope, didn't acknowledge the interruption. The SUV's door opened and a tall figure stepped out. Even before the man's features became clear, his bearing alone commanded immediate attention. He stood ramrod straight, his uniform crisp and adorned with the 2 stars of a rear admiral. His face was a mask of authority carved from years of command. Blackwood and his team instantly recognized Admiral David Bennett, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command. They snapped to attention, phones quickly pocketed, all traces of their previous amusement vanishing in an instant. "Admiral on deck," Blackwood called, his voice sharp and official. Bennett returned their salutes crisply, but didn't speak immediately. His eyes scanned the range, taking in the scene before him with practiced efficiency. When his gaze landed on Sullivan, still positioned behind his rifle, the Admiral froze. For a long moment, he simply stared, his expression shifting from official detachment to something none of the SEALs had seen on his face before: shock, followed swiftly by what could only be described as reverence. Bennett walked slowly toward the firing line, his movement careful as if approaching something sacred. His focus remained entirely on Sullivan and his rifle. "My God," the Admiral breathed, his voice barely audible. Is that Phantom?" Sullivan slowly lowered his rifle and turned to face Bennett. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. He nodded once. "It's been a while, Admiral," he said quietly. The name Phantom meant nothing to Blackwood or his team. It sounded like a nickname for a piece of equipment, not anything significant. Sensing a need to explain the situation and regain some control, Blackwood stepped forward. "Sir," he began, "this gentleman was just about to demonstrate his shooting technique for us. We were conducting 2,000-meter exercises and thought Mr. Sullivan might—" "Quiet, Lieutenant," Bennett snapped, not even glancing at him. The Admiral's eyes never left Sullivan's rifle. He reached out a hand toward it, but stopped short of touching it, as if it might burn him. "I haven't seen this rifle in 30 years, Bennett said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was just a story they told new recruits." He finally looked up at Sullivan, truly studying his face. A flood of recognition washed over his features. "Ray," he said, using the familiar name. "Master Chief Raymond Sullivan." "Is that really you?" Sullivan nodded again. "Just Ray now, sir. I left the rank behind a long time ago." Bennett turned to face the SEALs, his expression shifting to something hard and dangerous. The team had never seen the Admiral this way, his normal professional demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he demanded, his voice vibrating with restrained power. "Do you know what this rifle represents?" Blackwood, confused and increasingly uncomfortable, tried to salvage the situation. "Sir, with all due respect, it appears to be an older model sniper rifle. We assumed Mr. Sullivan was a what, Lieutenant?" Bennett's voice was dangerously soft. "A has-been? A relic? What exactly did you assume?" Blackwood swallowed hard. "Sir, we were under the impression he might be a veteran who had been invited for some kind of community outreach event." The Admiral let out a short, harsh laugh devoid of any humor. "Community outreach," he repeated, the words bitter in his mouth. "Lieutenant, you are standing in the presence of living history. This man is Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Sullivan. He was an original member of SEAL Team 6. He was operating behind enemy lines when your father was still in high school." The SEALs stood frozen, the Admiral's words hitting them like physical blows. The weight of their arrogance, their casual cruelty began to crush them. They looked at Sullivan, at his faded clothes and quiet demeanor, and tried to reconcile it with the legend the Admiral was describing. "And this," Bennett continued, pointing at the rifle with reverence, "is not just any weapon. This is Phantom, a custom-built M21, so heavily modified it's in a category all its own." He gestured to specific parts of the rifle. "That crack in the stock. It happened during Desert Storm in '91, when Ray used it as a brace to drag a wounded Marine out of a kill zone while under heavy fire. That electrical tape isn't just a field repair. It's a specialized, non-reflective ballistic wrap that also dampens vibration. That scope, which I'm sure you all had a good laugh about, has custom ground lenses that are still clearer than half the digital junk you use today. The Admiral took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the final devastating piece of information. In the mountains of Afghanistan, during the early days of the war, a high-value target, a Taliban warlord surrounded by a small army, was holed up in a cave system. We couldn't get a drone in, and an assault team was out of the question. The target was visible for only a few seconds at a time through a narrow gap in the rocks. He paused, looking out toward the horizon as if seeing the scene play out again before his eyes. The distance was impossible. The official estimate was over 500 meters. He let the number hang in the air. 5,500 meters. Over 3 miles. It was a ludicrous, mythical distance for a rifle shot. Command said it couldn't be done. It defied physics, they said. But someone remembered stories from Desert Storm from Panama, from a dozen other conflicts. They found Ray living quietly in Montana. They flew him and this rifle. Bennett looked at Sullivan with undisguised admiration. From a vibrating helicopter platform in a 30-knot crosswind, Ray took one shot. Just one. The spotter, using the most powerful optics we had, lost the vapor trail after 3,000 meters. For 10 seconds there was silence. The Admiral's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing the SEALs to lean in to hear him. And then the warlord's guards started scrambling. The target was gone. Neutralized. A 600-meter shot. It remains the longest confirmed kill in history, classified or otherwise. Most people who know about it think it's just a ghost story we tell to new recruits. But it happened. Bennett gestured to Sullivan. And this is the ghost. A profound silence descended upon the range. The desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Blackwood felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Sullivan, this quiet, unassuming old man, and saw him for the first time. Not as a relic, not as an object of derision, but as what he truly was, a titan hidden in plain sight. He and his men hadn't just been disrespectful. They had committed sacrilege. In that moment of heavy silence, Raymond Sullivan raised his rifle again. He settled it into his shoulder, the custom grip fitting his hand as if it had grown there. He took that same slow, measured breath. His focus wasn't on the 2,000-meter target the SEALs had been struggling with all morning. He was looking through it, through time itself, to targets and battles only he could see. The crack of the rifle, when it came, was not the violent blast of the SEALs' modern weapons. It was deeper, more resonant, the sound of history speaking. For a long, stretched moment, there was only the whistle of the wind. Then, faint but unmistakable, a single pure ping echoed back from the distant steel target. A perfect center hit at 2,000 meters, without a ballistic computer, without a spotting scope, without any of the technology the SEALs had been relying on all morning. Sullivan lowered the rifle and began to pack it away with the same unhurried care he had displayed from the beginning. He had nothing left to prove. Blackwood stumbled forward, his tactical helmet now feeling like a crown of shame. He stripped it off and, holding it at his side, his face pale with the realization of what he had done. "Master Chief," he began, his voice cracking with emotion. "Master Chief Sullivan, there are no words. My disrespect was unforgivable. I am deeply, profoundly sorry." One by one, the other SEALs stepped forward, removing their own helmets, their faces etched with a humility they had never known before. They offered their apologies, their voices low and sincere. Sullivan finished zipping his rifle case. He looked up at Blackwood, his pale blue eyes holding no malice, only a deep, abiding sadness. "The uniform changes," he said, his quiet voice cutting through their apologies. "The technology gets better, but respect has to be constant. You don't earn it with the trident on your chest. You earn it with the dignity you show to everyone, whether they wear a uniform or not." Admiral Bennett stepped forward, placing a hand on Sullivan's shoulder. "Ray wasn't here for a community day, Lieutenant," he said, his voice stern but controlled. "He's not some charity case. I invited him here to consult on our new extreme long-range marksmanship program. I wanted him to evaluate our shooters to see if any of you had what it takes." The final crushing irony landed on Blackwood. They weren't just mocking a veteran. They were failing a test they didn't even know they were taking. Blackwood swallowed hard, his career flashing before his eyes. But it wasn't his career he cared about in that moment. It was something deeper, more fundamental, the chance to learn, to grow, to atone. "Master Chief," he said, his voice barely a whisper, would you Would you teach us, Elise? Raymond Sullivan looked at the young faces before him. He saw their broken arrogance, their shame, and beneath it a flicker of genuine desire to improve, to understand. He saw not the boys who had mocked him, but the men they could become. He gave a slow, tired nod. First lesson, he said, gesturing to their high-tech rifles. You're all looking at the target, but you're not seeing the space in between. That's where the shot lives. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Coronado Range as the old master prepared to teach the new generation not just how to shoot, but how to see. Admiral Bennett stood before the SEALs, his commanding presence drawing their complete attention. The anger that had flashed across his features moments earlier had receded, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of reverence and nostalgic respect. The desert sun caught the polished stars on his shoulders, sending twin flashes of light across the range as he turned to face Raymond Sullivan. It's been too long, Ray, Bennett said, his voice softening as he addressed the older man. Sullivan nodded, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his weathered lips. Good to see you too, Dave. The casual use of the Admiral's first name wasn't lost on Blackwood and his team. Even among the tight-knit special operations community, such familiarity with a flag officer was rare. It spoke of a relationship forged in circumstances most men would never experience, a bond that transcended rank and time. Bennett turned back to the SEALs, his expression hardening once more into the mask of command they recognized. Lieutenant Blackwood, I want the range cleared for the next hour. Your team can observe from the pavilion. Yes, sir, Blackwood replied, gesturing for his men to fall back. The Admiral waited until the SEALs had retreated to a respectful distance before turning his attention back to Sullivan's rifle case. He knelt beside it with a reverence that seemed almost religious. I honestly thought I'd never see this again, Bennett said, his fingers hovering over the weathered canvas without touching it. After Afghanistan, the story of Phantom took on a life of its own, became something of a legend in the community. Sullivan shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Just a tool that does its job. You and I both know it's more than that, Bennett replied finally, allowing his fingers to brush against the canvas. This rifle has saved more lives than most combat surgeons. The Admiral stood his knees, protesting slightly, a reminder that he too was aging, though not as gracefully as the man before him. He glanced over his shoulder to ensure the SEALs were out of earshot before continuing. How's Montana treating you? Quiet, Sullivan answered, the single word conveying volumes. Just the way I like it. Bennett nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. Men like Sullivan sought peace after decades of war, not in bustling cities or suburban comfort, but in the solitude of wilderness where the silence could begin to wash away the cacophony of combat that still echoed in their minds. I wouldn't have called if it wasn't important, the Admiral said. I know. Their conversation paused as both men became aware of the intense curiosity emanating from the pavilion where Blackwood and his team watched, unable to hear, but desperately trying to interpret the interaction between these two figures, one at the pinnacle of naval power, the other seemingly ordinary, yet clearly extraordinary. Bennett turned to face the distant targets, squinting against the sun. They're good kids, he said, nodding toward the SEALs. The best we've got, technically speaking. But something's missing. Sullivan followed his gaze. Technology's changed. Human nature hasn't. Exactly. Bennett turned back to him. They've got equipment we couldn't have dreamed of back in our day. Optics that can see through darkness. Ballistic computers that can calculate 1,000 variables in seconds. But they're relying on the gear instead of developing the instincts. When the technology fails, and it always does, eventually they'll be lost. Sullivan nodded, understanding perfectly. He had seen generations of warriors come and go, each equipped with ever more sophisticated tools, each believing their advanced technology made them invincible. History had repeatedly proven otherwise. That's why I need you, Ray, the Admiral continued, not just for a demonstration or a pep talk. I need you to help design our new extreme long-range program. To teach these kids that technology is just a tool, not a replacement for true skill. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something only he could see. Been out of the game a long time, Dave, he finally said. Not sure I'm the right man anymore. Bennett laughed, a short, sharp sound. That shot you just made says otherwise. 2,000 meters first try with a rifle older than most of these kids. You haven't lost a step. At the pavilion, Blackwood watched the interaction between the two older men with burning curiosity. His mind was still reeling from the Admiral's revelations about Sullivan's identity and accomplishments. The embarrassment of his earlier behavior stung fresh a humbling experience for a man who prided himself on his judgment of others. "Who exactly is this guy?" Cooper whispered, echoing the question on everyone's mind. "You heard the Admiral," Wilson replied. "One of the original SEAL Team 6 operators." "That's not just any unit," Blackwood said quietly, his eyes never leaving Sullivan. "That's the predecessor to DevGru, the unit Richard Marcinko built from scratch. The men who defined modern special operations." The weight of that history settled over the team. SEAL Team 6, now officially known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, or DevGru, was the most elite counter-terrorism unit in the U.S.'s military, responsible for some of the most daring and classified operations in recent history, including the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. "And that rifle," Blackwood continued, "must be something truly special for the Admiral to know it by name." Their speculation was interrupted as Bennett and Sullivan began walking toward the firing line again. The Admiral gestured for the SEALs to approach. "Lieutenant Blackwood," Bennett called, "assemble your team." The SEALs quickly formed a line, standing at attention as the Admiral addressed them. "What I'm about to tell you is not classified, but it's also not common knowledge," Bennett began. "I believe context is important for what's about to happen here." He gestured to Sullivan, who stood slightly apart, his posture relaxed but alert, the unconscious vigilance of a man who had spent decades in harm's way. Master Chief Sullivan served in naval special warfare for nearly 30 years. He was part of the original SEAL Team 6, selected personally by Commander Marcinko. Before that, he was involved in operations that, quite frankly, changed the course of history. Grenada in '83, Panama in '89, Desert Storm in '91. The Admiral paused, letting the significance of these conflicts register with the younger operators. But perhaps his most significant contributions came during operations that you won't find in any history books. Operations that required a level of skill, precision, and nerves that few men have ever possessed. Bennett turned to Sullivan. "Ray, do you mind if I tell them about Panama?" Sullivan shrugged, his discomfort with being the center of attention evident, but his respect for the Admiral overriding his personal preference for anonymity. "December 1989, Bennett continued. Operation Just Cause. The invasion of Panama to remove Manuel Noriega from power. Ray was the senior sniper for a team tasked with preventing Panamanian Defense Force reinforcements from reaching the Comandancia Noriega's headquarters." The Admiral's voice took on the cadence of a seasoned storyteller, drawing the SEALs into a moment of military history most had only read about in training manuals. Ray and his spotter were positioned on a water tower overlooking a key intersection. The night was chaos, gunfire, explosions, civilians fleeing. Through all that confusion, Ray had to identify legitimate military targets, avoid civilian casualties, and maintain communication with ground forces, all while remaining undetected. Bennett glanced at Sullivan, who stood silently, his mind clearly transported back to that night in Panama. In the span of 4 hours, Ray took 17 shots, 17 confirmed kills, no civilian casualties, no friendly fire incidents. He effectively cut off an entire company of PDF soldiers from reaching the Comandancia, allowing our main assault force to secure the objective with minimal resistance. The Admiral let the magnitude of that achievement sink in before continuing. But the mission wasn't over. As dawn approached, their position was compromised. A PDF counter-sniper team located them and opened fire. Ray's spotter was hit, badly wounded. Despite being under intense fire, Ray managed to neutralize the threat, carry his spotter down 6 flights of stairs, and move 2 kilometers to the extraction point, all while continuing to provide covering fire for other operations in the area. Bennett's voice lowered. For his actions that night, Ray was awarded the Silver Star. He refused it, said he was just doing his job. The SEALs' expression shifted from professional interest to genuine awe. They looked at Sullivan with new eyes, seeing beyond the weathered exterior to the warrior within. That operation cemented Ray's reputation as one of the finest snipers our community has ever produced, Bennett concluded. But it was just one of many similar stories throughout his career. Sullivan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Dave's being generous," he said. "I had a good team." "Always deflecting credit," Bennett said with a knowing smile. "Another quality you don't see enough of these days." The Admiral turned back to the SEALs. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what true mastery looks like. It's not about the equipment. It's not about how many confirmed kills you have on your record. It's about dedication to the craft, respect for the fundamentals, and the wisdom to know that you're never done learning. He gestured towards Sullivan's rifle case. And that's where Phantom comes in. Ray, would you mind explaining what makes this weapon so special? Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. He knelt beside the case and carefully withdrew the rifle, holding it with the same gentle reverence a musician might show a priceless Stradivarius. Started as a standard M14, he began, his voice soft but carrying clearly across the still desert air. Modified to M21 specifications during my time with the teams. His fingers traced the worn wood of the stock with affection. The action's been hand-lapped for smoothness. Trigger pull adjusted down to 2.5 pounds. The barrel was originally military issue, but I replaced it with a match-grade Douglas stainless steel barrel hand-bedded to the stock. Sullivan pointed to the scope. Leupold Ultra M3A, modified with custom ground lenses and filled with nitrogen to prevent fogging at extreme altitudes or temperature changes. The SEALs leaned forward, their earlier derision replaced by genuine interest as Sullivan continued his explanation. The crack in the stock happened during Desert Storm. He said, his finger tracing the jagged line that ran through the walnut. We were pinned down outside Basra. Heavy artillery fire. One of our vehicles took a direct hit. Driver was wounded, trapped in the burning Humvee. Sullivan's eyes grew distant, seeing not the desert range before him, but the chaos of that long-ago battlefield. I used the rifle as a pry bar to free him. Stock cracked, but the action stayed true. After we got back, I reinforced it with this carbon fiber wrap. Looks like electrical tape, but it's actually a specialized material developed for the space program. Dampens vibration, prevents reflections. He hefted the rifle, demonstrating its balance. Every time I came back from a deployment, I'd make small improvements. New bedding compound, better cheek weld, tweak the harmonics. This rifle and I have evolved together over 30 years. Sullivan lowered the weapon, his explanation complete. The SEALs stood in respectful silence, their appreciation for the craftsmanship both of the rifle and of the man who wielded it evident in their expressions. Admiral Bennett nodded, satisfied that his point had been made. Now, he said, addressing Blackwood directly, I believe you and your team were having some difficulty with the 2,000-meter target. Blackwood straightened, his professional pride stung, but his honesty compelling him to acknowledge the truth. Yes, sir, the wind conditions are proving challenging. We've been close, but consistent center hits have eluded us. Master Chief, Bennett said, turning to Sullivan, would you be willing to share some of your methodology with these men? Sullivan considered the request, studying the faces of the SEALs who had so recently mocked him. He saw in them now something different, a genuine desire to learn to improve their craft. It was a familiar hunger, one he had seen in his own eyes decades ago. All right, he said finally, but we start with the basics. No technology, no ballistic computers, just the fundamentals. Bennett nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They're all yours, Master Chief. As the Admiral stepped back, Sullivan addressed the SEALs directly for the first time. First thing to understand, he began, his voice taking on a measured instructional tone, is that long-range shooting isn't primarily about the weapon, it's about reading the environment. When you pull that trigger, your bullet isn't traveling through a vacuum. It's moving through a living, breathing, constantly changing medium. He gestured toward the distant horizon where heat waves shimmered above the desert floor. Most of you are looking at the target, then consulting your instruments, then looking back at the target. That's backward. You need to see the space between you and the target. Really see it. Sullivan reached into his pocket and withdrew the same piece of yarn he had used earlier. This tells me more about wind conditions than any electronic sensor. Because it's not measuring at my position, it's showing me how the air is moving directly in front of my muzzle, which is what really matters. He held the yarn up, letting it dance in the breeze. The way it moves, the angle, it takes the subtle shifts in direction. All of these are telling me a story about what my bullet will encounter in the first few critical seconds of flight. Blackwood watched fascinated, despite himself, as Sullivan continued his impromptu lesson. The Master Chief moved with deliberate grace, demonstrating techniques and observational methods that weren't taught in any modern sniper school, but were clearly effective. Heat mirage. Sullivan continued, pointing toward the distorted air above the range. Most of you see it as an obstacle, something that obscures your view of the target. I see it as a map of temperature gradients and air movement. The way it bends and flows tells me exactly how my bullet's trajectory will be affected. He knelt, picking up a pinch of dust and allowing it to sift through his fingers. Humidity, barometric pressure, temperature, they all affect your bullet. Modern technology can measure these things, but a skilled shooter should be able to feel these conditions to intuit how they'll interact with his round. For nearly an hour, Sullivan shared insights and techniques developed over a lifetime of mastering his craft. The SEALs, initially skeptical, grew increasingly engaged as they began to understand the depth of knowledge behind the old sniper's seemingly simple approach. Finally, Sullivan returned to his rifle case. "Now," he said, "let me show you what I'm talking about." He reassembled his position behind Phantom, settling into a comfortable, stable stance that looked deceptively casual, but which the SEALs now recognized as the foundation of his extraordinary accuracy. "Lieutenant Blackwood," Sullivan called, "would you care to spot for me?" Surprised by the invitation, Blackwood quickly moved to position himself beside Sullivan with a spotting scope. "What am I looking for?" he asked. "Just watch the target," Sullivan replied, "and pay attention to what happens between here and there." Sullivan took a slow, deep breath, his focus narrowing once again to that singular connection between himself, his weapon, and the distant target. But this time he narrated his process, allowing the SEALs a glimpse into the mental discipline that made him exceptional. "Wind at my position is 8 miles per hour from 4 o'clock, he said softly. "But I can see from the mirage that it shifts to about 12 miles per hour from 3 o'clock at the midway point, then back to around 6 miles per hour from 5 o'clock near the target." His finger made minute adjustments to his scope. "Temperature's rising about 102 degrees now. Air's thin, barometric pressure dropping slightly, storm building to the west, though it won't hit for hours yet." The SEALs exchanged glances, amazed at the level of environmental awareness Sullivan was demonstrating without the aid of any instruments. "Distance is 200 meters, not 2,000, Sullivan continued. "Your range markers are off. Bullet will drop approximately 29 or feet over that distance. Flight time roughly 2.8 seconds. Blackwood blinked in surprise. Their own measurements had indeed shown the target to be at 2,000 meters. Could Sullivan be right? Adjusting for spin drift, Coriolis effect minimal at this distance, but still relevant. Earth rotating rightward under the bullet's path, compensating accordingly. Sullivan fell silent, then his breathing slowing, becoming almost imperceptible. His finger took up the slack in the trigger with glacial deliberation. The rifle barked, the sound rolling across the desert just as it had before. Through the spotting scope, Blackwood watched the bullet's vapor trail arc gracefully through the shimmering air, dancing with the wind currents exactly as Sullivan had predicted. The ping of a perfect hit echoed back to them an instant later. "Center mass," Blackwood announced, unable to keep the awe from his voice. Without pausing to acknowledge the achievement, Sullivan made a minute adjustment to his scope, shifting aim point to the left target. The SEALs hadn't even noticed the smaller target positioned slightly to the left of the main one, a steel plate no more than 12 inches in diameter at the same distance. Again, the rifle spoke. Again, the bullet found its mark with unerring precision. "Right target now," Sullivan said, making another tiny adjustment. A third shot, a third hit. Sullivan sat back, finally allowing himself a small nod of satisfaction. "That's how it's done," he said simply. The SEALs stood in stunned silence, the demonstration having far exceeded even their revised expectations. It wasn't just the accuracy that impressed them. Many snipers could hit targets at that distance with enough attempts. It was the consistency, the seemingly effortless precision, the complete mastery of every aspect of the craft. Admiral Bennett stepped forward, his expression one of quiet pride. "And that, gentleman, is why Master Chief Sullivan is here. Not as a guest or a curiosity, but as the benchmark against which you should measure yourselves." He turned to Blackwood. "Lieutenant, I invited Ray to evaluate our new extreme long-range marksmanship program, to see if what we're teaching the next generation of snipers is up to standard. Based on what I've seen today, we have significant room for improvement." Blackwood nodded, accepting the criticism without defensiveness. "Yes, sir, I believe we do." Bennett addressed the entire team. "Master Chief Sullivan has agreed to spend the next 2 weeks working with your unit. I expect you to learn everything you can from him. This isn't just about improving your marksmanship scores. It's about preserving and advancing a craft that has saved countless American lives. The Admiral checked his watch. I have to return to headquarters. Lieutenant Blackwood Master Chief Sullivan will be staying at the BOQ. Please ensure he has everything he needs. Yes, sir, Blackwood replied. With a final nod to Sullivan, Bennett returned to his SUV and departed, leaving the SEALs alone with their new instructor. An awkward silence descended on the range. The team, still processing everything they had learned about Sullivan and his extraordinary capabilities, seemed uncertain how to proceed. The shame of their earlier behavior hung in the air between them. Sullivan broke the tension, his voice matter-of-fact. Let's see your rifles. The simple request, professional rather than personal, gave the SEALs a path forward. One by one, they presented their weapons for Sullivan's inspection. He examined each with careful attention, offering specific observations and questions that revealed his deep technical knowledge of modern sniper systems. When he reached Cooper's rifle, he paused. You're using the new XM 2010, Cooper nodded. Yes, Master Chief. Just got it last month. Sullivan hefted the weapon, feeling its balance. Good system. Remington 700 action at its core, but significantly upgraded. How's it shooting for you? Honestly, Cooper admitted, I'm still getting used to it. The ergonomics are different from my old SR-25. Sullivan nodded. That's normal. Takes time to develop the muscle memory. But once you do, this will serve you well. He handed the rifle back. The key is to make it an extension of yourself, not just a tool you pick up when needed. The inspection complete, Sullivan looked out at the range, considering his next move. It's getting hot, he said. Let's break for lunch. Meet back here at 1400. We'll start fresh. As the SEALs gathered their gear, Blackwood approached Sullivan. Master Chief, he began, the formality of the address reflecting his respect. I want to apologize again for my team's behavior earlier. It was unprofessional and disrespectful. Sullivan studied him for a moment before responding. You've already apologized, Lieutenant. I've accepted it. No need to dwell on it. Still, so, Blackwood pressed, I'd like to make it right somehow. Sullivan considered this. You want to make it right? Learn what I have to teach, then pass it on. That's all the amends I need. With that, he turned and began packing his rifle, signaling that the conversation was over. As Blackwood walked back to join his team, his mind was churning with questions about Sullivan, about Phantom, about the legendary 5,600-meter shot in Afghanistan that the Admiral had mentioned. But he recognized that Sullivan was a man who valued actions over words, respect over curiosity. The answers would come in time, if they came at all. Miles, the youngest member of the SEAL team, lingered behind as the others headed for their vehicles. He approached Sullivan hesitantly, waiting until the Master Chief looked up before speaking. Master Chief Sullivan, he said, his voice betraying his nervousness. I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you. Sullivan nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. My father, Miles continued, he served in Somalia, Task Force Ranger. He used to tell me stories about a SEAL sniper who saved a lot of lives during the Battle of Mogadishu. Sullivan's expression shifted subtly, a flash of recognition and old pain quickly masked. Said this sniper was positioned on a rooftop overlooking the city, Miles went on. When things went bad, when the Blackhawks were shot down, he provided covering fire that allowed several Rangers to reach safety. My father was one of them. Sullivan stood very still, his weathered face revealing nothing, but his eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if seeing through time to that chaotic day in 1993. He never knew the sniper's name, Miles said. Just called him Ghost because he seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing whenever they needed him most. I always wondered if Somalia was a long time ago, Sullivan interrupted gently. A lot of good men served there. A lot of good men didn't come home. Miles nodded, understanding the deflection, but pressing on. My father didn't come home from Iraq, 2010, but before he deployed, he made me promise that if I ever met a SEAL sniper with an old rifle who seemed like he could shoot better than anyone alive, I should thank him, because chances were that would be the man who saved his life in Mogadishu. Sullivan's stoic expression softened almost imperceptibly. What was your father's name, son? Staff Sergeant Thomas Miles, sir, 75th Ranger Regiment. For a long moment, Sullivan was silent, his gaze fixed on some middle distance. Then he reached out and placed a hand on the young SEAL's shoulder. Tommy Miles, he said quietly. He was a brave man, chilled, committed to his team. You should be proud. Miles swallowed hard, emotion evident in his face. I am, sir. Sullivan squeezed his shoulder once, then let his hand fall away. Your father saved my life too, you know. Pulled me out of a bad spot when my position was compromised. We all looked out for each other in those days. The admission seemed to cost Sullivan something, as if acknowledging that long-ago connection opened a door he preferred to keep closed. But the look of gratitude on Miles's face made it worthwhile. Thank you for telling me that, Master Chief, Miles said. It means a lot. Sullivan nodded. See you at 1400, Petty Officer Miles. As Miles departed, Sullivan remained by his rifle case, momentarily lost in memories. Somalia, Panama, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. Decades of service in the shadows of precision violence delivered at extreme distances, of lives taken and saved through the crosshairs of Phantom. He had come to Coronado reluctantly, pulled from his self-imposed exile in Montana by Admiral Bennett's insistence that his skills were still needed. He had expected to find a new generation of warriors too reliant on technology, too disconnected from the fundamental skills that had defined his era. And in that, at least, he had not been disappointed. But in young Miles, Sullivan saw something familiar, something that reminded him of himself at that age, a genuine desire to master the craft, not just to complete the mission, but to honor those who had come before. Perhaps there was hope for this new generation after all. Sullivan finished securing Phantom in its case. The rifle had been his constant companion through war and peace, the one thing that had never failed him, never betrayed him, never left him. It was more than a weapon, it was a repository of memories, a physical embodiment of his life's work. As he lifted the case, Sullivan felt the familiar ache in his shoulder, an old wound from Somalia that had never fully healed. A reminder of cost and consequence, of the fine line between success and failure that every sniper walks. The afternoon session would be challenging. The SEALs had potential, but they had developed bad habits, become too dependent on their advanced equipment. Breaking them of those habits would not be easy or comfortable. But discomfort was the beginning of growth. Pain was the precursor to strength. These were lessons Sullivan had learned through decades of hard experience, lessons he now had the opportunity to pass on. He walked slowly toward the base housing Phantom, secure in its case, the weight familiar and comforting against his side. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, the heat a tangible presence against his skin. In that moment, Raymond Sullivan felt something he had not experienced in many years' purpose. Not the grim determination of a mission, not the focused intensity of a shot, but something broader, more meaningful. For 30 years, he had served his country by taking lives when necessary, by watching through his scope as enemies fell. Now perhaps he could serve by teaching, by ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of his generation was not lost to the seductive promise of technology. It was not the path he had expected in his twilight years, but as he had learned time and again throughout his long career, the best shots often came from unexpected angles. Behind him, the SEALs watched his departing figure with newfound respect. The legend of Phantom was no longer just a story to them. It was flesh and blood walking among them, offering them a connection to a history they had only read about. And as the desert heat shimmered around Sullivan's silhouette, rendering him momentarily ghost-like in the distance, they understood at last the weight of the legacy they had inherited and the responsibility they bore to carry it forward. The afternoon sun hung low over the Coronado Range, casting long shadows across the packed earth. The temperature had peaked at 105 degrees earlier, but was now beginning its gradual descent toward the relative mercy of evening. Raymond Sullivan stood at the firing line, watching as Blackwood's SEAL team reassembled after their break. The men moved differently now, more deliberately, with a new awareness of Sullivan's presence and what he represented. Blackwood approached first, his posture reflecting a careful balance between military formality and genuine respect. The team is ready, Master Chief. Sullivan nodded. Good, but we're not shooting yet. Confusion flickered across the faces of the assembled SEALs. They had spent the morning hours in humbling demonstrations of Sullivan's extraordinary marksmanship. Surely the afternoon would build on that foundation with practical application. Rifles down, Sullivan instructed. We're going to walk. Walk, Master Chief, Cooper asked, unable to mask his surprise. Walk, Sullivan confirmed his tone, making it clear this was not a suggestion. 1,000 yards out and back. I want to show you something. Without waiting for further questions, Sullivan began moving downrange, his pace unhurried but purposeful. After a moment's hesitation, the SEALs fell in behind him, exchanging puzzled glances, but following his lead. As they walked, Sullivan spoke without turning his voice, carrying clearly in the still desert air. Most snipers spend their entire careers on this side of the bullet's path. They never truly understand the space their round travels through. The group continued in silence for several hundred yards, the only sounds their boots on the hard-packed earth and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The targets grew larger as they approached, steel silhouettes shimmering in the heat. Halfway to the targets, Sullivan stopped abruptly and knelt, beckoning the SEALs to join him. When they had gathered around, he picked up a handful of dust and let it sift through his fingers. "Feel that?" he asked. "It's different here than at the firing line. Finer, less moisture. The composition of the soil changes the way heat radiates, which affects air density." He pointed toward the horizon. "Look at the mirage. See how the pattern shifts between here and the targets. That's not random. That's information." The SEALs studied the heat waves rising from the desert floor, trying to see what Sullivan saw. For most, it remained just a distortion, a visual obstacle to overcome. But Blackwood narrowed his eyes, tilting his head slightly, and something seemed to click. "It's like currents," he said quietly. "Like watching water flow around rocks in a stream." Sullivan's weathered face showed a flicker of approval. "Exactly. Air isn't static. It moves in currents, eddies, updrafts. A bullet doesn't fly through air, it swims through it." He stood and continued walking, the SEALs following with newfound attentiveness, studying the landscape with fresh eyes. When they reached the targets, Sullivan circled behind them, inviting the team to join him. "This is where your bullets end their journey," he said, "but the story of the shot is written in the space between." He gestured back toward the distant firing line, now 1,000 yards away. "From here you can see the whole picture, the bullet's entire flight path. Most snipers never get this perspective. They live at one end of the equation and send rounds to the other, but they never truly understand the middle." Miles studied the view with particular intensity. "It's like seeing both sides of a chessboard at once." Sullivan nodded. "A good analogy. When you go back to the firing line, I want you to remember this view, to hold it in your mind when you take your shot. The target isn't just a destination, it's the endpoint of a journey your bullet undertakes." The walk back was quieter, each man lost in contemplation of this new perspective. Sullivan set a pace that allowed for observation, stopping occasionally to point out subtle features of the terrain that influenced airflow and temperature gradients. When they finally returned to the firing line, Sullivan gathered them once more. "Now, he said, we shoot, but differently than before. I want each of you to fire a single round at the 2,000-meter target. But before you pull the trigger, I want you to close your eyes for 10 seconds and visualize the entire path of your bullet from muzzle to target." The SEALs exchanged skeptical glances, but no one voiced an objection. Sullivan's demonstration that morning had earned him the right to unconventional methods. "Blackwood," Sullivan said, "you're first." The lieutenant stepped up to his rifle, settling into position behind it with practiced efficiency. He made his usual calculations, dialing in adjustments based on the environmental data from his instruments. "Now close your eyes," Sullivan instructed. "See the shot before you take it." Blackwood obeyed, his features relaxing as he concentrated. 10 seconds later, he opened his eyes, made a small adjustment to his scope, and fired. The bullet arced through the desert air, its path visible through the spotting scope as a faint trail against the backdrop of blue sky. It struck the target just off-center, not perfect, but closer than any of Blackwood's morning attempts. "Better," Sullivan acknowledged. "Cooper, you're next." One by one, each SEAL repeated the exercise. Some improved their accuracy, others did not, but all approached the task with a new seriousness, a recognition that they were being taught something fundamental that had been missing from their training. When the last man had fired, Sullivan nodded. "Again, but this time I want you to leave your ballistic computers turned off. Use your eyes, your judgment, your feel for the conditions." Blackwood hesitated. "Master Chief, with respect, those computers are standard equipment now. They're part of our operational gear." Sullivan fixed him with a steady gaze. "And what happens when they fail? When the battery dies, or a bullet damages the electronics, or you find yourself in a situation where there's no time to input the data?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable, yet undeniable. The SEALs had become so reliant on their technology that the idea of operating without it was almost foreign. I'm not saying technology doesn't have its place. Sullivan continued, his tone softening slightly. I'm saying you need to master the fundamentals first, then use the technology as a supplement, not a replacement. Blackwood nodded, accepting the wisdom in the older man's words. He returned to his rifle, removed the power source from his scope's ballistic calculator, and prepared for a purely analog shot. His first attempt missed the target completely. Try again, Sullivan said without judgment or criticism. But this time, trust your instincts more than your training. Feel the wind, don't just measure it. Blackwood took a deep breath, recalibrating his approach. He studied the mirage as Sullivan had taught them, noted the subtle dance of dust particles in the air, felt the whisper of breeze against his cheek. When he fired again, the round struck the outer edge of the target. Progress, Sullivan acknowledged. The afternoon continued in this vein, with Sullivan guiding the SEALs through increasingly challenging exercises, each designed to wean them from their technological dependencies and reconnect them with the primal instincts of a true sniper. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, casting the range in golden light, Sullivan called a halt to the shooting. That's enough for today, he said. Your minds are full. Let it settle overnight. The SEALs began breaking down their equipment, their movements measured and thoughtful, so different from the cocky efficiency they had displayed that morning. The change was not lost on Blackwood as he watched his team, a quiet pride beginning to replace the shame of their earlier behavior. Sullivan was packing Phantom into its case when Blackwood approached him. Master Chief, he began, I wanted to thank you for today. The team learned more in a few hours with you than we have in months of formal training. Sullivan nodded, acknowledging the gratitude without embellishment. They're good shooters, just need to reconnect with the basics. Blackwood hesitated, then pressed on. Admiral Bennett mentioned a shot you made in Afghanistan, 5,600 meters. I've never heard of anything even close to that distance. Sullivan continued, securing his rifle, his movements deliberate, giving no indication whether he intended to respond to the implicit question. The team and I were wondering, Blackwood continued carefully, if you might tell us about it, not for the story but for the lessons. What made that shot possible when conventional wisdom says it shouldn't have been? Sullivan closed the rifle case and straightened his pale blue eyes, meeting Blackwood's. For a long moment he was silent, weighing the request against his natural reticence. It wasn't just one thing, he said finally, his voice low enough that Blackwood had to lean in slightly to hear. It was everything, a lifetime of experience distilled into a single moment. He picked up his case, clearly preparing to leave, but instead of walking away, he surprised Blackwood by continuing. The briefing said the target was impossible, beyond the effective range of any known sniper system, beyond the limits of human capability. A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips. But impossible is just another way of saying, no one's done it yet. Blackwood listened intently, aware that he was being granted a rare privilege. The other SEALs, sensing something significant, drifted closer, their cleanup forgotten as they tuned into Sullivan's quiet words. They flew me into a forward operating base near the Pakistan border, briefed me on the target, a Taliban warlord responsible for dozens of American deaths. He was holed up in a cave complex that was inaccessible by ground forces. Airstrike was ruled out due to the civilian presence. Sullivan's gaze grew distant, seeing not the Coronado Range but the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. The only possible shot was from a ridge across the valley, but the distance— he shook his head slightly. The rangefinders couldn't even give an accurate reading. They had to use satellite imagery to calculate it. 5,600 meters, give or take. The SEALs exchanged glances, the magnitude of the challenge sinking in. Even the most advanced modern sniper rifles were only effective to about 1,500 meters under ideal conditions. Beyond that, the variables became too numerous, too unpredictable. The mission planner said it was impossible, Sullivan continued. The bullet would have to stay in flight for over 7 seconds. In that time, the Earth's rotation would affect its path. The air density variability would change multiple times as it traveled through different temperature gradients. The wind conditions would vary along the entire trajectory. He looked down at the rifle case in his hand. But Phantom and I had done impossible things before. Sullivan fell silent again, and for a moment Blackwood thought that might be the end of the story. But after a deep breath, the older man continued. They put me on a helicopter at dawn. The plan was to insert me on the ridge, let me set up, and then extract immediately after the shot, successful or not. But as we approached, we started taking fire. Heavy machine guns, ARPs. The pilot couldn't land, couldn't even hover safely. His voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if recounting a routine training exercise rather than what must have been an extraordinary crisis. The mission commander wanted to abort. I told him to hold the helicopter as steady as possible and open the side door. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only play we had. Blackwood could picture the scene: a helicopter bucking in mountain turbulence, taking fire from multiple directions, while Sullivan attempted to set up a shot that would be considered nearly impossible under perfect conditions. The aircraft was moving in 3 dimensions, Sullivan said. Up, down, side to side. The rotor wash was creating its own wind currents. The vibration made it nearly impossible to keep the target in the scope. He paused. But sometimes when all the variables become too complex to calculate, you have to stop thinking and just feel. Sullivan looked up, meeting the eyes of each SEAL in turn. I stopped trying to compute the shot and let instinct take over. All those years of experience, all those rounds sent downrange in every conceivable condition, they culminated in that moment. His voice dropped even lower, forcing the men to lean in further. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I don't remember the recoil. I just remember watching through the scope as the target stepped into view for a brief moment, and then he wasn't there anymore. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of the desert wind. The spotter couldn't track the round, Sullivan concluded. Too far, too many variables. We didn't get confirmation until we were back at base and the forward observers reported the target had been eliminated. He hoisted the rifle case. It wasn't me who made that shot. It was every shot I'd ever taken before, every lesson I'd learned, every failure I'd experienced. The impossible becomes possible when you've spent a lifetime preparing for it. With that, Sullivan turned and began walking toward the parking area, leaving the SEALs to absorb the impact of his words. Blackwood caught up to him a moment later. Master Chief, he said, we usually gather at the O Club after training. The team would be honored if you'd join us. Sullivan paused, considering the invitation. Social interaction had not been part of his plan when he agreed to Admiral Bennett's request. His life in Montana was deliberately solitary, a quiet existence far removed from the brotherhood that had once defined his days. Thank you, Lieutenant, he said, but I should review tomorrow's training plan. Blackwood nodded, accepting the gentle refusal without pressing further. Of course, we'll see you in the morning then. Sullivan continued to his truck, placing Phantom carefully in the passenger seat rather than the bed, a habit born of decades treating the rifle as a partner rather than a tool. As he settled behind the wheel, he caught sight of Miles standing near the range entrance, apparently waiting for him. Sullivan sighed inwardly but rolled down his window as he approached. Petty Officer Miles, he acknowledged. The young SEAL seemed nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Master Chief, I was wondering if I could ask you something about my father. Sullivan had expected this since their earlier conversation. The connection to Miles's father, Staff Sergeant Thomas Miles, a ranger he had indeed protected during the chaotic Battle of Mogadishu, had stirred memories he had long kept buried. Go ahead, he said, preparing himself for questions about heroism or battle details, the kind of war stories young men often sought from veterans. Did he seem happy, sir? Miles asked the question so unexpected that Sullivan found himself momentarily speechless. It's just, I was only 12 when he was killed in Iraq. My memories of him are a child's memories. I've heard all the stories about him as a soldier, but I know almost nothing about him as a man. The vulnerability in the request cut through Sullivan's carefully maintained emotional distance. This wasn't hero worship or morbid curiosity. It was a son trying to know his father. Sullivan turned off the truck's engine. Get in, he said, nodding to the passenger seat. Miles carefully moved Phantom's case to the back seat and slid in beside Sullivan. Your father, Sullivan began, choosing his words with care, was what we called a quiet professional. Never the loudest voice in the room, never the one telling war stories at the bar. But when things got bad in Mogadishu, when it felt like the whole city was trying to kill us, he was steady, unshakable. Miles listened intently, drinking in these details of a man he had lost too soon. He had a picture of you, Sullivan continued, kept it in his helmet, showed it to me during a lull in the fighting, told me you were going to grow up to be either a ranger like him or, God forbid, a SEAL. A smile touched Miles's face at this revelation, a connection to his father he had never known existed. He talked about taking you fishing when he got home. Said you had a special spot by a lake somewhere. Eagle Lake, Miles said softly. In the Sierras. We went there every summer until he deployed. Sullivan nodded. That's the one. He described it in detail. Said the sunrise there was like nowhere else on Earth. For the next hour, as darkness settled over the Coronado base, Sullivan shared what memories he had of Thomas Miles. Small moments amid the chaos of battle, quiet conversations during long watches, the universal concerns of a father far from home. Not the heroic ranger of official accounts, but the man behind the uniform. When they finally ran out of stories, Miles sat in silence for a long moment. "Thank you, Master Chief," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Sullivan nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude but understanding its necessity. "Your father was a good man, Miles. He saved my life in Mogadishu, pulled me out when my position was compromised. I never got the chance to properly thank him." "You're doing it now, sir," Miles replied, "by remembering him, by teaching his son." The simple truth of that statement settled between them an unspoken bond forming across generations of warriors. Miles opened the door to leave but paused. "Master Chief, the team really would be honored if you'd join us tonight. Not at the O Club, but somewhere quieter, a place where we can continue learning from you." Sullivan considered declining again, but something in the young SEAL's earnest request broke through his usual reserve. "All right," he said finally, "one drink." The quieter place turned out to be a small beachfront bar far from the base, a local establishment unmarked by military memorabilia, or the usual trappings of a venue catering to service members. The SEALs had secured a corner table with a view of the Pacific away from the sparse weeknight crowd. As Sullivan entered with Miles, the team rose in a gesture of respect that felt natural rather than forced. Blackwood pulled out a chair at the head of the table. "Master Chief," he said, "we took the liberty of ordering you a drink." He nodded toward a glass of amber liquid. "The bartender said it's their best bourbon." Sullivan settled into the chair, acknowledging the courtesy with a nod. "Appreciate it." An awkward silence threatened to descend, the social dynamics still uncertain after the transformative events of the day. Cooper surprisingly broke the tension. "Master Chief," he said, "I owe you the biggest apology of anyone here. The things I said this morning about your rifle, they were disrespectful and ignorant." Sullivan studied the young SEAL for a moment before responding. "You judged based on appearance rather than substance," he said evenly. "A common mistake, but a dangerous one in our line of work." "Yes, sir," Cooper acknowledged. "A mistake I won't make again." Sullivan lifted his glass in a subtle toast. "Then no harm done." The conversation gradually eased into a more natural rhythm, with the SEALs asking questions about Sullivan's career, his techniques, his experiences and conflicts, that for them were merely history. He answered selectively, deflecting queries about classified operations or those that strayed too close to personal terrain, but sharing enough professional insight to satisfy their curiosity. As the evening progressed, Blackwood observed a subtle change in Sullivan, not a dramatic transformation, but a slight unbending, as if layers of emotional armor were being cautiously, temporarily set aside. "Master Chief," Blackwood said during a lull in the conversation, "may I ask a personal question?" Sullivan regarded him steadily. "You can ask. Might not answer." "Fair enough." Blackwood nodded. "I was wondering, after all you've accomplished, after all you've seen, what made you choose Montana? Why live so far from everything and everyone?" The question hung in the air, its personal nature acknowledged by the respectful silence that followed. Sullivan took a slow sip of his bourbon, considering his response. "After Afghanistan," he began. "After that impossible shot, something changed. I'd pushed the boundaries of what could be done, reached the pinnacle of my craft. There was nowhere higher to climb." He set his glass down carefully, but it wasn't just that. Over 30 years, I'd seen too much through my scope, taken too many lives even if they needed taking, carried too many memories. The SEALs listened with rapt attention, aware they were being granted a rare glimpse behind the professional facade. Montana offered space, silence, room to breathe and think. No one looking to me for decisions that might get them killed. No one depending on my shot to save their lives. Sullivan's weathered face softened slightly. Just mountains and the kind of solitude that lets a man make peace with his past. Blackwood nodded, understanding more clearly now the man behind the legend. Thank you for sharing that, Master Chief. Sullivan acknowledged the thanks with a slight inclination of his head. Your father was military, wasn't he, Lieutenant? Surprised by the question, Blackwood nodded. Yes, sir. Army, 10th Mountain Division. How did you know? The way you carry yourself, Sullivan replied. The respect for tradition, the leadership style. It has the mark of someone raised in the culture, not just trained in it. Blackwood smiled. He served in Iraq during Desert Storm. Used to tell me stories about a legendary SEAL sniper who could hit targets no one else could even see. His eyes widened slightly as the connection suddenly became clear. Wait, was that you? Was my father talking about you all those years? Sullivan shrugged, neither confirming nor denying. There were a lot of good snipers in that conflict, but the slight twinkle in his eye told Blackwood all he needed to know. He would be honored to know I'm learning from you now, Blackwood said softly. Sullivan raised his glass again. To those who came before, he said, and those who carry on. The SEALs joined the toast, a moment of quiet communion between generations of warriors bound by duty, sacrifice, and the unique brotherhood of those who volunteer to stand between their nation and its enemies. As the evening drew to a close, Sullivan rose to leave. 0600 tomorrow, he reminded them. We have a lot of ground to cover. The SEALs stood respectfully, thanking him for joining them. As Sullivan turned to go, Blackwood spoke once more. Master Chief, he said, would you consider extending your stay beyond the 2 weeks Admiral Bennett mentioned? The team and I feel we barely scratched the surface of what you could teach us. Sullivan paused, studying the faces before him. Young men who had begun the day as arrogant professionals and ended it as humble students, eager to learn from a master they had initially dismissed. We'll see, he said, but the slight softening around his eyes suggested the possibility was not unwelcome. As he walked alone along the moonlit beach toward base housing, Sullivan reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had come to Coronado reluctantly, a solitary man drawn from self-imposed exile by a sense of duty to his former comrade, Admiral Bennett. He had expected to endure the assignment, to fulfill his obligation, and return to his mountains as quickly as possible. Instead, he found himself reconnected to something he had thought lost, the profound satisfaction of passing on hard-won knowledge, of seeing understanding dawn in a student's eyes, of honoring the traditions and techniques that had defined his life's work. In young Miles, he saw echoes of Thomas the Ranger, who had saved him in Mogadishu. In Blackwood, he recognized the same hunger for mastery that had driven his own early career. Even in Cooper, initially the most dismissive of his abilities, Sullivan perceived a genuine desire to improve, to excel, to become worthy of the trident they all wore. Perhaps he thought as he walked there was room in his life for more than solitude. Perhaps the peace he sought didn't lie solely in the silence of mountains, but also in the act of transmission, of ensuring that what he had learned through decades of service would not die with him but would live on in a new generation. Tomorrow would bring another day of instruction, of breaking down and rebuilding the SEALs' understanding of their craft. But for tonight, Raymond Sullivan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The legend of Phantom would continue not as a ghost story told to new recruits, but as a living tradition carried forward by those who had learned directly from its source. In that perhaps lay a different kind of immortality than the one he had achieved through his impossible shot in the mountains of Afghanistan. Not the immortality of a single extraordinary feat, but the enduring legacy of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. A different kind of precision, a different kind of impact, a different kind of honor.